Grab a drink, but don't go too far. Our program resumes in 1 minute.
Hoje é dia de sol, alegria de coió, é curtir o verão.
Vem, Magalenha, rojão, traz a lenha pro fogão, vem fazer armação. Hoje é dia de sol, alegria de coió, é curtir o verão.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Here to lead us in a discussion on diversity, equity, and inclusion, please welcome Jesse Cortez, HITEC board member and Vice President, Executive Talent and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for McKesson.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the HITEC session here. As we continue our conversation, we've heard from some good speakers already, and Ramon Baez and Miriam, fellow board member, as well as Steve, and then now Carla recently here. So we'll continue some of this conversation. Certainly, I enjoy the opportunity of kind of hearing some of the, I'll call it live music in between sessions to bring our levels back up to level 5, level 6, right? And even 7, as Carla has described. So I'm eager to kind of get us started here, but maybe before we do, I'll do a quick check-in myself as the voice of God kind of shared with you. I am part of the HITEC organization and have been with the organization for almost 12 years now with the pleasure of actually serving on both boards, the HITEC organization as well as the HITEC Foundation. And so I'm eager to introduce our folks, but maybe just before I get a chance to introduce our panelists here one-on-one and give them a chance to check in as well. I hail from Chicago, but my family is from Mexico. And so I'm a proud Mexican American. When we started to put this panel together, one of the things that we wanted to key in on was this notion of accelerating and accelerating inclusion, right, for the outcome to achieve equity. And so what we wanted to do was bring our panelists together, give them a chance to sort of tell their story as to how they believe, accelerating inclusion can really get to equity, but also some of the learnings around some of the positive milestones and even some of the challenges that have emerged. And so we're excited to kind of share this with you as well. And so I'll go around the horn here and give each of you an opportunity to introduce yourselves. So I'll go here in alphabetical order, the way they're listed on my screen here. So Alex, I see you first with Cisco. If you wouldn't mind sharing a bit about yourself.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And so I'm Alex Allen. I am the global director for inclusion and collaboration at Cisco. I work specifically in the customer experience, operations, and also the sales and marketing organizations. I've worked for companies such as Nestle, GE, and Home Depot, and I've been in diversity and inclusion for the last 5 years. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for joining us. I also see Lucida next.
So I tell people the best way to remember my name is don't lose sight of me, because it rhymes with Lucida.
And you did remind me of that last time as well.
So thanks, Jesse. It's so great to be here. And I am the head of employee D&I with JP Morgan Chase. My team sent me a shirt that I realized if the camera angle isn't right. So I'm representing JP Morgan Chase. I've been with the firm 3 years. And I, some of you here come from different industries, and I think that's the beauty of having a diversity and inclusion background. Currently at JP Morgan Chase, I'm responsible for helping our global head of diversity and inclusion drive the D&I agenda across our entire employee population of 250,000 employees. And prior to that, I was in another part of the business. In one of our lines of businesses, running D&I for the last 3 years. I've worked in hospitality, insurance, media, and a lot of different industries over the years. So I'm very excited to be here. And like you, was really happy to hear the music. My family's from Puerto Rico, so it brought back fond memories. And I was doing a little salsa in my chair, getting ready.
Yeah, those green rooms are fun when we can get a chance to at least cut a rug a little bit, right?
Yeah.
So Susan Reed, I see you next. If you wouldn't mind maybe introducing yourself as well.
Good afternoon, good morning, I guess, depending on where you are. It's nice to be here. I don't have any real tricks for you remembering my name, but it's so boring that it's easy to remember. I'm thrilled to be here, and I was enjoying the music. I don't think I've been on a virtual Zoom yet where we've had the joy of music leading into a panel, so really thrilled to be here.
Yeah, thank you. I do have maybe one ask, if you wouldn't mind, Susan, before I introduce James here. I know in your title you had mentioned that you're also the director for the Institute of Inclusion. Would you mind sharing just a bit about that?
Oh, happy to, proudly. So last year, amidst the racial equity crisis that engulfed the country, one of the things that we thought about here at Morgan Stanley is how do we make a difference in both inside Morgan Stanley, but in the world beyond. And our chairman and CEO, James Gorman, thought that one of the ways that we could do that is to stand up an institute committed to driving diversity, equity, and inclusion. Again, helping to shape our internal strategy. We've had a D&I team for a long time, so it's not a new effort, but an institute with a board of external advisors who would provide input and help to shape our internal strategy. But also help to advise and shape where we contribute in the walls, beyond the four walls of Morgan Stanley. So that's the Institute. We're still very much building. We launched with a scholarship program last year. We're building on that, and we're building on a number of initiatives. And I'm sure we'll talk about that more throughout the panel.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing that. So last but not least, James.
Thank you so much, Jesse. Thank you, esteemed panelists. To everyone watching, hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is James. My pronouns are he, him, el, and I have the distinct privilege of looking after global inclusion and diversity at Twitter. We're going to talk a lot about some of the things we're doing at Twitter. So I think that perhaps the best way to introduce me is to share a little bit about my personal journey. I was born in the Central Valley of California, which, if you know the 209 area code, you know it's known for two things, farmers and migrants. Both of my parents are immigrants, and I was basically raised on the knee of my abuela because my dad was in the fields. And my mom had this radical idea that she would go to college and have a career, which for a Mexican woman in the 60s was completely unheard of. But my childhood was marked by a time in the Central Valley where it was just deeply unpopular to be mixed race, Latinx, migrant families. And so at a very early age, I learned to hide parts of who I am. And for better or for worse, that talent would come in very handy as I hit high school, because I would start to come to terms with my sexuality. And it was the height of the AIDS epidemic. And the only thing I knew about gay people was what I saw on the TV, which was they are monsters. And I knew I didn't want to be that. And so I hid into myself a little deeper. And it wasn't until I stepped foot on the Berkeley campus that for the very first time in my life at 18 years of age, I saw an example of what it looked like for someone to show up as their full, authentic self. And that did two things for me. That gave me permission, and that gave me power. And I share that because with the benefit of retrospect, I realize that I have spent my entire life's work cultivating permission and power in other people, while simultaneously working to reimagine the systems that would ever require that be true to begin with. And it really informs how we think about the work at Twitter. And I'm happy to be here with all of you to share some of the work that we're doing.
Well, thank you, James. I appreciate you sharing your story with us, and all of you, all the panelists. Maybe as we get started, one of the things that we began to discuss, right, when we started to put kind of thought behind, what we would discuss today. One of the elements that came through was this notion of equity, right? And we heard Carla say, right, that things have begun to change around the DEI space, or diversity, equity, and inclusion space. But those of us that have been in that arena for some time know that equity has been largely a part of the conversation. It just may now start to feel like it's hitting more of the public, you might say, right, or the public eye. So I'd love to just maybe go around the horn here again and have you each maybe talk about what equity really means to you on a personal level, and maybe we'll start with Susan this time.
Thank you so much, Jesse. I mean, I think I love that you're starting with that question. I think equity is such an important word, and I think so many of us are starting to bring it more and more into our our conversation. And what I love about it is it basically says, let's set aside this idea, right, that it's one size fits all when it comes to DE&I solutioning, right, and that you really have to think deeply about what a population needs in order to thrive, right? And that the level playing field, we know that doesn't exist, but even for groups that are considered quote unquote minority groups, which we know that's not the case anymore, the issues are not the same, right? So whether you're talking about the Black population, the Hispanic Latinx population, or certainly with everything going on, our Asian American, colleagues, partners, and friends, the issues aren't the same. And so how do you make sure that within your DE&I strategy, your plan, that you're really thinking carefully about what each group needs? And look, that is a very complex subject to peel apart, but I think you've got to start somewhere. And so, we've done some things, for example, like, for years, we would look at diversity metrics and we would sort of lump Black and Hispanic together. And we don't do that anymore, because we know when you do that, you hide issues, right? You hide issues for some populations if you combine all your populations, or if you combine, Black, Hispanic, and Asian, you're hiding issues. And so peeling apart, understanding what each group needs. I think, last thing I'll say on this is, of course, the challenge that it presents for all of us as DE&I professionals is none of us have, time in the day, extra time in the day. And so the more you look at sort of these separate issues, the more you start to develop a pretty long agenda in terms of the things you have to do. And so I think one of the challenges we then face is approach the work through the lens of equity. But then I think, quite frankly, we've still got to figure out how we solution in ways that solves at both levels, solves across groups, but also solves within group, and do it with the time, resources, the money, and the brain space that we have. And that's always the challenge.
Yeah, no, very well said. That's for sure. Alex, you want to go next?
Sure, Jesse, thank you. Absolutely. And well said, Susan, well said. When I think of equity, I think of the systems that we have. So when we think about the employee journey, and we think about how we hire, how we develop, how we engage, how we promote, that entire process of the employee journey, how do we embed fairness in each one of those steps in the process? So I do agree with Susan. I think communities have different challenges. Communities have different issues. But I also think that there is also a system or a way that we can apply equality and equity and fairness throughout each steps of those process. We're going to talk a little bit about those processes in just a little bit, but one process that I think we all kind of deal with on a day-to-day basis is the hiring process, right? And so how do we, from an attraction standpoint, from a selection standpoint, from a interview panel standpoint, how do we ensure that we have some idea and some controls, but flexible controls, to be able to give our leaders and hiring managers a process to ensure that they are approaching it in a way that they could mitigate bias. So that's my thought on equity.
Yeah, no, good point on bias as well. Anytime we get a chance to certainly minimize the impact there, it is an important step for any organization. James, what would you add to the this whole notion of equity, right? And sort of your sort of personal perspective here.
Sure. It is such a timely and topical question. And, if you look at the simple definition of equity, look it up in the dictionary, you're going to see something like, equity is defined as fairness or justice in the way that people are treated. And so then what exactly is fairness and how do we define justice? And what we know is that these concepts are not absolute. They are shaped by each individual's worldviews and experiences and contextualized by world events that are happening around us. And so for me, that means on the one hand, the definition of equity is a perpetually moving target, but rather than that being something that is a barrier, I think that is beautiful because it gives us the opportunity to center the needs of the people in how we think about responding and driving equity throughout our workplaces. And I'll give you a great for example. Obviously we'll talk a lot about, I'm hoping we'll talk about a lot about last year and what it meant for our work. But certainly what we saw was that the needs as it relates to fairness and justice in the workplace for our Black tweeps. By the way, tweeps is what we call ourselves. There is an absurd amount of bird analogies at Twitter. It starts a little corny, but you get used to it, that our Black tweeps were hurting. And so, we start each journey with deep listening. And what we heard was the relentless series of world events centered in anti-Blackness was creating a level of trauma for Black tweeps that was unprecedented in their career journeys. And so what we knew immediately that in order to serve the needs of these communities, we needed to get help and make it available as part of our benefits offering. So we quickly identified therapists who are Black therapists with specialty in unpacking trauma associated with anti-Blackness and racism. We got them immediately into our benefits coverage in plan portfolio. And then we started hosting a series of events for these Black tweeps called Take Care, where folks could come in small groups and have direct one-on-one conversations with these therapists. Yeah. That is a great example of how fairness and justice as the core tenets of equity is constantly evolving. And we have a responsibility and opportunity to meet people where they are and make sure that we are always delivering fairness and justice.
Yeah. Lucidia, what would you add?
Yeah, I think when I think of the term equity, I think about how people misuse or use it interchangeably with equality. And I think what everyone's talked about is, when we think about how communities are different, the fact that we need to do a better job at helping to define. I started using an image. You've all probably seen the equity versus equality images. And, when you think of equality, and if you think of an image of people trying to look at something happening over a fence, and everyone's different heights, and everyone gets one rock, that's equality, right? And you can step up, and for the tallest person, you can see over the fence and see what's happening, but maybe for the shorter person, you can't. And equity is about giving people what they need, right? And giving communities what they need to be successful. So that means the person in that image, the shorter person maybe gets 3 rocks, because then when you stack those rocks, you can see over the fence. And then the tallest person might only need 1 rock, because that might be the edge that they need to help, overcome that fence or that barrier. And ultimately, I think what we want to get to is we remove the barriers, right? We remove the fence. So we don't need different things. And of course, we'll still need different communities still will have different needs. But if we start, getting to the root of the systemic issues that are creating the barriers in the first place, we won't have to do all these workarounds.
Yeah. Yeah, James, you had mentioned obviously, kind of reflecting back on 2020, and certainly Carla kind of walked us through there. And actually, I would say that Miriam and Steve also kind of discussed a bit about, the sort of new working environment, right? Remote, virtual. Certainly, the folks that are in the audience today are no strangers, right, to this work and the technology that sort of powers some of these connections. But when we think about sort of these conditions, if you will, right? And what has your company done really to sort of close some of those connection gaps? And what was some of the impact that has driven maybe some of the action so far, and what that impact has been like?
Sure, great question. Well, I mean, we all know it, 2020 did the most. And just when we thought it was over, surprise, 2021 showed up and continued to do even more. And if you know anyone working in I&D who does not tell you that this has not been the most challenging period of their professional career, it's one of two things. They're either not doing the work right, or they're straight out lying to you. And while there are parts of our companies that when this is long over in the rearview mirror might contract to some semblance of normal, that is not true for DEI work. Our portfolios and our scope of work has been forever expanded, and there's no going back. And quite frankly, I see that as a good thing. I don't want to go back. And here are just a few highlights of the work. So, 2020 was without question a reckoning for marginalized communities, but more importantly, it was a reckoning for the systems and the people responsible for the marginalization. And if there's any silver lining to last year, it's that, we welcomed millions of more allies to this movement. And at Twitter, we really leaned in and gave them tools and resources to understand how to show up for hard-hit communities and center their needs in their response. And so while we harnessed the support of allies, we never lost focus on a core principle at Twitter, which is we center the tweets most impacted in how we design responses. And that journey starts with deep listening. And here are just a few things that we launched in 2020 that we heard and then acted on for our tweet. So first, we heard tweets everywhere needed help adjusting to remote work. So we upped our benefits and reimbursements, recognizing that not everyone across all communities has easy access to the essentials of work from home, like reliable Wi-Fi and monitors and ergonomic equipment. We heard that parents were especially hard hit at the beginning. So we reconfigured our benefit offerings to cover increased child expenses, introduced flexible work schedules, and brought in experts to provide guidance and support to our Twitter parents. And then, of course, the most important for the context of the discussion is the work we did around xenophobia, racism, and white supremacy. A year ago, before all this began, I couldn't imagine we would ever host a company-wide discussion about anti-Blackness, white supremacy, and the role that systemic racism can play in the workplace, how to spot it, and what we can all do to dismantle it. But it's what the year demanded. And so we launched programming that was unique to 2020, but we are continuing to fund and pull forward through the year because we see it driving direct progress on creating an inclusive workplace. During a year when we faced unprecedented struggles, our most marginalized communities were hurting 2 or 3 times over. And at Twitter, as employers, we saw it as our job to acknowledge and support those employees in ways that doubled down on our commitment to their success.
Yeah, well, and I think that's an important element, right? Is how do we maintain sort of that commitment? And Susan, maybe I'll ask you to maybe chime in on the same question, but maybe also talk about the way that we maybe help support, right? And maybe build awareness, if you will, for our leaders and our managers, and so how they can support diverse populations, even right with sort of this more virtual environment.
Yeah, no, Jesse, thanks for that. And James, I love everything that you did at Twitter. We did a lot of similar things here. So I think it's good to hear that we all sort of shared a similar approach. It means we probably got, some things right. What I would add to what James said is one of the things we committed to is continuing the learning, right? So beyond the session that we did where we talked about race, how do you continue the learning? And what we decided to do was to dissect that and get deeper on specific topics that we needed to sort of explore. And so, for example, we brought in Robin DiAngelo, and we talked about, her book, White Privilege, and where that allowed us to go is to this whole discussion around allyship, right? And I think, bringing our managers back together to continue the learning. So you sort of, in my mind, they had the 101 and trying to understand race issues in the US. Now, how can you help? Well, allyship is one, but help you understand what that really, really means, right? And as Robin so brilliantly said when she was here, it is not for someone else to decide that they're an ally to the Black community. It's for the Black community or the Hispanic community or the Asian community to say, okay, you are behaving and acting in a way that tells me you are truly an ally, and therefore I see you and accept you as an ally, right? And that was important because I think, a lot of times people want to put that label on, themselves. But I think Robin's teaching our managers that you don't get to decide if you're an ally. The people who need the allyship get to decide that based on your actual behaviors. Bringing in Tony Mayo from Harvard, who talked about the research that he does that showed two things in particular. One is that women of color are least likely to ask for help when they need it. We just kind of go at it, and Rome could be burning, stuff could be falling apart at home, but we're going to show up to work and we're going to deliver, and nobody's going to know. We're going to be crisp as a white shirt, and nobody's going to know. And we don't ask for help. And so if you know that as an organization, then you're looking for whatever signs you can look for, and you're proactive about figuring out where, your employees need help, but also talking about bias in performance evaluations. So sort of trying to get to root cause issues and getting managers to think about how they might be making biased decisions as they're evaluating people, and challenging people to think about, when you sit down to write a PE and you're using certain words and terms to describe a Hispanic employee or a Black employee, think about what it is that you're putting on paper and how are you evaluating them? And are you evaluating them against a standard that they shouldn't be evaluated against? Do you have certain stereotypes in your head? We talk a lot about, when people say, you're articulate, and the expectation that you're not going to be because you're Black or Hispanic or Asian or Asian American, right? And so that's a stereotype, that's a bias that you've got in your brain, and you sort of have to check yourself if you find yourself looking back at your PEs and you've got that word tagged to everybody who's Black or brown. So I think getting to, breaking apart this big concept of systemic racism and trying to drill down and look at specific issues is very important, and is something that we're working on here. And look, we're not done, Jesse. We have a ton more to do, but we've started and we're committed to continuing that process.
Yeah, no, that's great. Alex, I'm going to ask you as well, but maybe one thing that I'll share with our audience too is we'd love to kind of hear maybe some of the great things that your companies are doing as well, right, to address some of these issues as well. But Alex, Cisco's been a longstanding partner, right, of HITEC for a long time. Tell us maybe some of the things that sort of, you've been able to incorporate, given kind of what's happened over the past year, to continue to sort of differentiate, right, your environment or your culture, et cetera.
Yeah, just a couple things. One, thank you, Jesse. One thing, and this is beautiful. I love all the social justice commitment that each company has here. So Cisco, let me start real quick. Cisco's purpose is to power an inclusive future for all. And we have this idea of a conscious culture, or building awareness around difference. And so that's kind of the overarching strategy and vision of Cisco. And then what Cisco did last year was really around the same things that we've heard, created a social justice commitment in 12 actions and beliefs that the company was going to put in place and then also implement over a 5-year period. And what we believe is that we wanted to have technology for good. And the most important part is we want to address this insecurity. So where people are harmful when they belonging based on their identity. And so that was one core element of our strategy. Now, let me give you a very tangible example. And I'm going to go back a little bit. In 2019, Chuck Robbins, our CEO, and Brian Stevenson, who's the executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative and also the founder, had a courageous conversation. So this is well before, some of the George Floyd's murder and such. And they had a courageous conversation around this idea of the power of proximity. And I happened to be, in the room at the moment he was talking, and this idea that if you are close to the problem, you'll be compelled to solve it. And when you're close to the problem, insights would emerge, understandings would emerge that leaders would take upon themselves and solve the problem. So that was the idea of corporate social responsibility. So a few weeks later, we had a leadership meeting. And you, Jesse, Maria Martinez. So she's been part of the HITEC 100 for the last few years.
We were having a corporate board, actually, here at McKesson.
Exactly. And she, we were having a leadership team meeting. I happened to be her D&I person. And one leader in the back of the room said, "Hey, Alex, I want to take action. I want to do something tomorrow to drive inclusion." So I was like, you have to get proximate with your talent. So just like Brian Stevenson mentioned a few weeks later, in that room, in that moment, we looked around and Maria approved. Let's go ahead and let's get proximate to our talent that is maybe underrepresented and understand their experience. So we've been on an 18-month journey. And what we have found is that when leaders are vulnerable and transparent in these conversations with people that might be different than them, insights are emerging. Insights like exclusive culture, insights like lack of visibility to leaders, insights like around equity or fairness that leaders are taking upon themselves to take action. Because us as D&I experts, we can only do so much. There's only so many programs that we can roll out. It's got to be the leadership behavior. And so that when you tie that back into powering an inclusive future for all in a conscious culture where we're trying to build awareness, it's the leader's awareness. So I'll stop there, but you got me excited, Jesse.
Yeah, no, we feel it. We love it. And so, Lusaida, so maybe we pivot there. Let's talk about how, we talk about accelerating inclusion, accelerating equity, right? How does that translate into accelerating talent, right? Especially with kind of today's environment. And, how have you thought about removing some of the barriers? You obviously put it very beautifully around removing these barriers, right, to give people opportunities. Tell us, how you think about this.
Well,
Go ahead, Alex.
You go ahead. You go ahead, please, Lucina.
No, you're on a roll, Alex. I want to hear.
So let me just make sure I'm not out of turn. Jesse, is that question for me or is that for someone else?
Yeah, let me start with Lusaida. Maybe we'll go back.
Okay.
We'll come back around.
Sorry about that.
No, not at all. I think what I'll say in terms of, I'm going to continue on where Alex was going, because getting proximate to your employees is really the way that you're going to see a difference. So, we do a lot to support our organization and our leaders. We have scorecards, there's metrics, we look at metrics, and especially in financial services, numbers are everything. And for a bank, numbers are everything. But it's also helping leaders understand the numbers are not everything when it comes to people, because there's people behind those numbers. So we want to increase our representation. We want to, make sure that we have the representation at senior levels across the organization. But we can't just focus on the numbers to do that. You have to get to know the people, and you have to understand what their challenges are, what their issues are. Sometimes it's just getting to know people and learning things about people. It's those relationships. And the other thing is, I was kind of chuckling, Alex, when you talked about the leader who's like, let's do it now. This, when we think about what's happened specifically in the US and the impact that slavery has had for the last 400 years, you don't just fix that overnight. And, I think the whole point about getting proximate, if you're close enough to, Alex, you put it way more, much more articulate than I am going to do it right now. But, the whole point about really understanding the problem, like it takes time to understand what the issues are. And so while I certainly appreciate when leaders in my organization want to jump in and fix it and do something, it's also balancing that it doesn't happen overnight. This is a long-term journey that we're all on. If it took us 400 years to get here, it's going to take us a long time to really get to the final end state that we all want to see.
Sure. Susan, James, I want to bring you into the conversation too, but I'm also going to share right with our audience that, please, provide any questions that you may have. We'll go into a Q&A session here momentarily. But while they do that, James, Susan, I would love to maybe let's stick to that, right? How do you think about setting goals, measuring progress, right, and holding people accountable? What are your thoughts? Maybe I'll start with James, and then Susan, would love for you to chime in too.
It's such a great question. It's one that really animates me, because I think there is a common misperception that DEI work is sort of, these soft skills, very people-centered, very, qualitative, if you will. And it's with good reason, because a lot of that is in fact true. But we are also practitioners of a space that by its very definition needs to be guided by the same targets, metrics, accountability that we drive everything else that's important across our businesses. Where I think companies are doing really well is there's a pretty established practice for setting targets, measures, accountability, and numbers around workforce representation. We know that because a lot of the DEI work is originated in the United States based on EEOC requirements, right? And so the numbers for diversity, I think there's a mature system in place. I think where, understandably so, a lot of companies might struggle more is when it comes to inclusion, because then you're really talking about what people feel is the squishy stuff, right? But at Twitter, we see that as equally foundational to the work. So because we know that employee culture and, importantly, inclusion happens in teams, and most importantly, your relationship with your manager, we knew that that's where we needed to focus. And so over the past year or so, we took a really good look at our employee engagement survey to develop a set of questions that together produce an inclusion score, not just for the company overall, but also for leaders and their teams. And then we looked at the data and the ranges. We set a threshold for anyone who manages people at Twitter. And then we bundled it with a bunch of behaviors that we want to drive across those people managers, because we know these behaviors are highly correlated with inclusion. And then we just gave it a fancy name. It's called the Inclusive Manager Badge. Just made that up. But if you go to Go Inclusive Manager Badge, it's one of your 4 required goals in Workday if you manage people. And then we said the Inclusive Manager Badge will require these things of you throughout the year. So to get your Inclusive Manager Badge at Twitter, not only do you have to meet that very specific Inclusive Manager score in the employee engagement survey, you also have to complete all of your IMD trainings. And importantly, you have to have 100% completion rate across all of your teams and all of your direct reports for all of your IMD trainings, and then engage with our BRGs and their programmings and events regularly throughout the year. And once we launched that, the response that we saw, the things we were hearing from parts of the organization that quite frankly, we had never heard from before, told us that we were getting towards the middle, the management middle, that we really needed to recruit to be part of this solution.
Yeah, thanks, James. Susan, you know, as you sort of think about, you know, some of what James shared, you know, what resonates and what would you add maybe to the way that Morgan Stanley's looking at this as well?
You know, the combination of what James and Lucida said, you know, numbers matter. I think if you're not measuring, you're missing something. Numbers can also lead you down a false path, and you can think that as long as kind of you got numbers on a page and you got goals that you're good. You know, I mentioned we stood up the Institute for Inclusion recently. We had a board meeting just a few weeks ago, and our board members reminded us that it's not just about representation, but it's also about how people feel in your organization. And I bet all of us on this call can attest to times, maybe even now, when we were the only person of color at in a group, in our organization, in a division, and yet we still felt like we belonged. We would have loved to have more company, more people who looked like us, but we still felt like we belonged. And I think companies have to think about what were the set of things that happened, because until we fix the bigger problem, Lucida talked about this, the pipeline, getting more folks of color into our firms, we're always going to have a math problem with fewer of us than we'd like. But that's not an excuse for not having people feel like they're part of the organization, and there are a set of behaviors that drive that. And if I think companies can think deeply about that, then we actually will find ways to keep people in place and grow them, even though they may be in small numbers, right? And I don't think anybody's totally figured it out, but I think it's something that we all need to be spending more and more time on.
Sure. Well, I know we're only down to just a couple minutes here left. I do have one question that has already surfaced that, Susan, you actually started to answer a bit of this, but I'd like to give Lucida and maybe Alex kind of the final thoughts here on this question. But the question is, what are companies doing to retain women and Latinx or underrepresented talent during COVID pandemic?
Sure, I'll start. One of the things that JP Morgan is doing that we're going to announce shortly in the next couple of weeks is that we have gone deep in our communities and supporting key communities across the organization. We identified a leader to run our Black strategy internally and externally a couple of years ago. We have someone running a strategy for women across the organization, internally and externally. So what that means is it's in support of our employees, but also connecting with women in the marketplace. How do we help, women be business owners? And in a few weeks, we're going to stand up and announce a leader to run a Latinx strategy internally and externally for the organization. By the end of the year, we'll have strategies for LGBT+, for veterans, people with disabilities, and 6 what we call vertical D&I strategies across the organization. So I think that's one of the ways that we're putting really targeted focus on these communities to help support them.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll break up the next question into 2 pieces here. Alex, maybe if you could give us kind of a 30-second, I know I'm pressing you for time here, but maybe 30 seconds around how, you would hold leaders accountable for fostering D&I.
Yeah, thank you, Jesse, and I'll get right into it quickly. So going back to Maria Martinez, I'm on her team helping her run a business transformation. And so I'm embedded in the business, paid for by the business. My team is set up in the business. And what we have is a strategy around hire, develop, and engage. And we have our focus areas where we have underrepresented groups. And our focus for Latinx and Hispanic Latino is very specific. How do we drive and create that pipeline of talent? How do we ensure that we're engaging with them from a proximity standpoint and understanding their experience at Cisco? How do we comp them related to the compensation and the fairness and equality around that? And then also around promotion parity. So we're looking at promotion parity as well related to how are the promotional systems as well as the decisions that we're making. And so we have this in a very simplistic strategy because, you know, in D&I, you can go down a lot of, it's broad, right? So
Sure.
we've been able to say, hey, these are the few things that we're going to focus on and get very deep in that discipline, whether hire, develop, and engage. Lastly, we have a similar situation as Lucia related to we call them employee resource groups. So for that Hispanic Latino employee resource groups, we have a strategy around how we want to engage with the community.
Yeah, James, one last question here. I know we're up on time, but maybe there's another question around tying compensation to goals. What are your thoughts there?
No, we love it. So at Twitter, we have a deep commitment to transparency and accountability. And I'll go quick because I know we're out of time. All tweets can access a real-time dashboard to see how their teams are doing against the IND goals that we've set. We publish quarterly updates publicly on our progress. And then this year, we not only introduced those new standards for managers, but we also announced that executive pay will be tied to our ability to meet our diversity goals. But when we think leaders, it's not just our executives. Our BRGs are led by incredible tweeps doing important work. And it's critically important to the company. And we recognize that we need to treat it like we treat everything else that's important at the company. So each BRG also has a strategic plan that aligns with the IND strategic plans, has accountability measures, and importantly, we acknowledge that the work of our BRG leaders is just as important to Twitter as every other part of the company. So last year, we took the step to introduce a formal compensation plan for all of our 63 BRG leaders because that work cannot be volunteer-led or just a side hustle.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank all of you for your passion, your energy, and your thought leadership in this. I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation and look forward to having us stay connected through our HITEC familia. And I'll turn it back over to HITEC. Thanks, everybody.
We would like to thank our corporate partners for their continued support of HITEC and belief in our mission to provide a forum for the leadership development and advancement of technology executives in the Hispanic community. Thank you to our summit host sponsor, JP Chase & Co. Thank you to HITEC's platinum sponsors, Accenture, AWS, Bank of America, Capital One, Cisco, Google Cloud, KPMG, Microsoft, Twitter, and United Airlines. Thank you to our HITEC Gold partners, Apple, AT&T, BNY Mellon, Citi, Dell, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, Johnson & Johnson, Liberty Mutual, Lockheed Martin, McKesson, Morgan Stanley, Nationwide, Northwestern Mutual, Oracle, PwC, P&G, Salesforce, ServiceNow, Trend Micro, and Wells Fargo. Thank you to the HITEC Silver partners, Freddie Mac, HP, IBM, SAP, Schneider Electric, Tech Systems, Travelers, and Visa. Thank you to our HITEC Bronze partners, Adobe, Amazon, Amdocs, Capgemini, Cardinal Health, Claro, Cognizant, Comerica Bank, DocuSign, Globant, Link America, NGI, Pinnacle Group, Pyramid, Reviture, Workday, and Worldwide Technologies. Once again, mil gracias to all our corporate partners.